Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. Margaret's voice sliced through the air like a sharp knife. How many times do I have to repeat myself? Success! Are you deaf or just plain useless? The walls of the house absorbed the weight of her anger, trembling beneath the force of her words. Success flinched, but said nothing. She stood still, her fingers trembling as she clutched the handle of the glass she had just placed on the dining table. It wasn't broken, wasn't even misplaced, but Margaret always found a reason to be displeased. Richard, who had been sitting nearby, sighed heavily. He wanted to step in, to calm his wife before the moment spiraled into yet another tense evening, but he knew it was pointless. Margaret was always angry these days, and there was no reasoning with her when she got like this. The house, once warm and filled with the soft hum of conversation, had become a battlefield where only silence ensured survival. Margaret turned sharply, her heels clicking against the tiled floor as she walked away, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She could feel Richard's gaze burning into her back, but she refused to meet his eyes. She didn't need his pity or his disapproving sighs. What did he know about what she was going through? About the way she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, counting the months between one miscarriage and the next? What did he know about the way her body betrayed her every time she dared to hope? She had lost count of how many times she had sat in a hospital gown, clutching her stomach as doctors murmured condolences she no longer wanted to hear. And yet, every time she felt the stirrings of a new life inside her, she allowed herself to believe again, only to watch it slip away. It was unbearable. The weight of it sat heavily on her chest, crushing her beneath its cruel grip. And then there was Success. Success, who had been born without struggle, who had never known the pain of an empty womb. Margaret didn't hate her, not truly, but the sight of the girl, a living, breathing reminder of another woman's success, made her feel like a failure. The tension in the house never faded. Richard had learned to pick his battles, to step carefully around his wife's emotions, but even he had limits. He loved Margaret. He had married her with hope in his heart, believing that love could heal the wounds of grief, but lately it felt as if love was not enough. He watched Success retreat to her room, her shoulders stiff, her steps careful, and he hated what this house had become. He hated that his daughter barely spoke, that the home he had built with his first wife now felt like a prison. He knew Margaret was hurting, but he could no longer ignore the damage she was inflicting. As he glanced toward the closed door of their bedroom, where Margaret had disappeared, he made a silent decision. Something had to change. If Margaret refused to see the cracks in their home, he would force her to confront them before it was too late. Margaret sat in front of her sewing machine, her fingers moving mechanically as she pushed fabric beneath the whirring needle. The rhythmic hum should have been soothing, but tonight it grated on her nerves. The half-stitched gown before her, a custom order from one of her high-profile clients, blurred in her vision as frustration gnawed at her. She was exhausted, but sleep never came easily these days. If she closed her eyes, all she saw were hospital rooms, sterile white sheets, and the solemn faces of doctors delivering the same verdict over and over again. A sharp breath left her lips, and she stabbed the pedal harder, forcing the machine to move faster. She needed to drown out the thoughts, needed to focus on anything other than the emptiness clawing at her insides. But the house would not let her forget. From the hallway, she could hear Success moving about, her steps light and careful, as if she were afraid to make noise. Margaret's jaw clenched. She didn't know what irritated her more, the girl's constant presence, or her desperate attempts to disappear. Richard, seated in the living room with a medical journal in his lap, listened to the quiet tension that had become the rhythm of their home. He rarely read these days. His eyes followed the words, but nothing ever registered. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become unbearably silent. Margaret had always been passionate, fiery even, but this anger inside her was different. It wasn't the sharp frustration of a woman dealing with life's daily stresses. It was deeper, darker, an anger born of grief and disappointment, one that festered in her bones and poisoned everything around her. He had tried to reach her, had tried to remind her that they were in this together, but Margaret had built a wall around herself, one he could no longer climb. His gaze flickered to the stairs, where Success had disappeared moments ago. He ached for his daughter, for the way she shrank herself within these walls, careful not to upset the fragile balance of the house. Richard had promised himself that he would protect her, that no matter what, she would never feel like a stranger in her own home. And yet every day he watched Margaret chip away at the girl's spirit with cold words and unyielding glares. How much longer before Success stopped trying to belong at all? Upstairs, Success sat at the edge of her bed, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The walls of her room, once a sanctuary, felt like they were closing in. She had learned long ago that silence was her best defense, that if she made herself small enough, invisible enough, she could avoid her stepmother's wrath. But no matter how careful she was, it was never enough. The anger in Margaret's eyes whenever she looked at her was impossible to miss, even if she never truly understood why it existed. Success had never asked to be here, had never asked to be the daughter of a man who had moved on and remarried. She had simply been born, and for that, it seemed, Margaret could not forgive her. A soft sigh left her lips as she leaned back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling. She wanted to ask her father why he let things be this way, why he never defended her the way she wished he would. But deep down, she already knew the answer. He was trying to keep their home together, trying to love a woman who had long stopped believing in happiness. And so, like always, Success swallowed her questions, her sadness, and her pain, retreating further into herself. The morning light filtered through the curtains in streaks of gold, illuminating the dust floating in the air. Margaret sat at the dining table, stirring her tea with slow, absent-minded movements. The spoon clinked softly against the porcelain, the only sound breaking the silence. Richard had already left for work, and Success was upstairs, likely preparing for her morning classes. The house felt unbearably empty, yet the emptiness did not bring peace. It gnawed at her, made her restless. She glanced at the untouched plate of toast before her and pushed it away, her appetite long gone. Her body ached, whether from stress, exhaustion, or something deeper. She did not know. The night before had been another restless one, plagued by a dream she could barely remember. It left behind a lingering unease, a sensation that clung to her like damp air. Her fingers tightened around the spoon. Lately, something felt different, as if the walls of her carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crack. A soft knock at the door broke her thoughts. Margaret blinked, realizing she had been staring at the steam rising from her tea for far too long. The knock came again, hesitant but firm. She sighed and rose to her feet, moving with sluggish steps toward the entrance. When she opened it, a familiar face greeted her, Helen, her closest friend from church. Helen stood with a warm smile, carrying a small container wrapped in a cloth. "I made some pepper soup," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Thought you might need it." Margaret managed a small nod, leading her friend to the living room. They sat in silence for a moment before Helen finally spoke. "Margaret," she said gently, her eyes searching. "You haven't been yourself." The words struck something deep within her. Margaret bristled, her first instinct to deny it, to push Helen away like she had done with everyone else. But something in her friend's gaze, patient, knowing, made her hesitate. "I don't know what you mean," she murmured, but her voice lacked conviction. Helen reached forward, placing a hand over Margaret's. "I know you've been struggling," she said softly, "and I know you won't talk about it. but shutting people out won't make the pain go away. Margaret swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. She wanted to argue, to tell Helen that she didn't understand, that no one did. But wasn't that the problem? Hadn't she spent years burying her sorrow, pretending it wasn't there, only for it to fester into something she could no longer control? She exhaled, pressing her fingers against her temples. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, the words foreign on her tongue. Helen squeezed her hand, her expression unwavering. "You don't have to fix it alone," she said. "Let people in, Margaret. Let God in." The words settled in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Margaret had always believed in faith, but somewhere along the way, she had let her grief overshadow it. She had allowed bitterness to take root where hope once lived. Helen's visit was brief, but when she left, Margaret sat in silence, staring at the spot where her friend had been. For the first time in a long while, she felt something shift within her, a whisper of change, a crack in the silence she had built around herself. Margaret stood by the kitchen sink, watching the steady stream of water cascade over her fingers. The sensation was oddly grounding, a fleeting distraction from the thoughts circling in her mind. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like the comfortable solitude she once craved. Instead, it was an uneasy stillness, thick with emotions she had spent years trying to suppress. Helen's words had lingered long after her departure, resurfacing at odd moments like an itch she couldn't quite reach. "You don't have to fix it alone." Margaret had always believed strength meant endurance, that pain was something to be carried in silence. But lately, that silence had grown heavier, pressing down on her chest with a weight she could no longer ignore. Her grip on the dishcloth tightened as she thought back to the dream that had been haunting her nights, the one she never spoke about. It was always the same, a dimly lit corridor, a familiar voice calling her name, and a presence she could never quite see. She had dismissed it as stress, as exhaustion, but deep down, a part of her knew better. She dried her hands and made her way upstairs, her footsteps light against the polished wooden floor. The air felt different here, heavier, as if it carried remnants of things left unsaid. Margaret hesitated outside the guest bedroom, the one she rarely entered. She didn't know what had drawn her here today, only that she suddenly felt compelled to step inside. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a space frozen in time. Stacked against the far wall were old storage boxes, untouched for years. A strange unease prickled at the back of her neck as she stepped forward, her fingers trailing across the dust-covered lids. Without fully understanding why, she pulled one open, her breath hitching as she took in its contents. At the very top, folded with careful precision, was a faded maternity gown. Margaret stared at it, her throat tightening. The memories came flooding back. Afternoons spent with her aunt, the soft lull of conversation, the scent of freshly baked bread lingering in the air. And then the sharpness of their arguments, the cutting words she had flung carelessly in moments of frustration. "You're just lazy," she had accused. "You act like pregnancy is an excuse for everything." The memory burned now, its cruelty more evident with the passage of time. Her hands trembled as she sifted through the other items, a framed picture, a collection of letters, fragments of a past she had long tried to forget. A strange sensation curled in her chest, something between regret and realization. She had always dismissed her aunt's anger, chalked it up to pettiness, to weakness. But standing here now, with the weight of her own failures pressing against her ribs, she could no longer ignore the truth. She had been cruel, thoughtless. And now, the same bitterness she once resented in her aunt had taken root in her own heart. Was it possible that she had done this to herself? That the curse, if it even existed, was nothing more than the consequences of a heart hardened by resentment? Margaret inhaled sharply, her pulse unsteady. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel it, the guilt, the sorrow, the years wasted in anger. And in that moment, A single, terrifying thought took hold of her mind. What if the key to her healing had been within her all along? The evening air was thick with the scent of rain, the sky a deep shade of gray as distant thunder rumbled across the horizon. Margaret sat in the living room, staring at the untouched cup of tea on the table before her. The weight of the past clung to her shoulders, making the simple act of breathing feel labored. Since opening that storage box, she had been unable to shake the flood of emotions it had unearthed. She had spent the better part of the day oscillating between anger, regret, and an unsettling sense of clarity. How had she spent so many years refusing to acknowledge the damage she had done? How had she let herself become the very thing she once despised? The thought gnawed at her, its sharp edges cutting into her pride. I was just a child, she reasoned, but the excuse felt hollow now. She had been old enough to know better, old enough to understand that words could wound just as deeply as actions. And yet she had dismissed her aunt's pain, belittled her struggles, and walked away without looking back. Now, standing on the other side of suffering, she could no longer deny the truth. She had carried cruelty in her heart, and in return, life had shown her its sharpest edges. A creak on the staircase pulled her from her thoughts. Success stood at the bottom step, hesitating as their eyes met. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The girl's wariness was evident, the years of Margaret's sharp words and cold indifference etched into the way she held herself, tense, guarded, always prepared for disappointment. Margaret felt a pang of something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Guilt? Sadness? Perhaps both. She cleared her throat, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Are you hungry?" she asked, the words foreign on her tongue. Success blinked, as if unsure she had heard correctly. A flicker of confusion crossed her face before she quickly masked it with indifference. "I already ate," she said quietly. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken words neither of them knew how to voice. Margaret wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the distance between them, but the years of resentment stood like an unmovable wall. How did one begin to atone for a lifetime of wrongs? How did she ask for forgiveness from a child she had spent years treating like an outsider? The thought made her throat tighten, but for the first time, she did not let the discomfort push her away. Instead, she nodded slowly and gestured to the couch. "Would you like to sit with me for a while?" Success hesitated again, her fingers tightening around the railing. Margaret could see the battle playing out in the girl's eyes, the instinct to retreat warring with a cautious curiosity. Then, after a long moment, she stepped forward, settling into the seat across from her. They sat in silence, the only sound the steady rhythm of raindrops against the windowpane. Margaret felt the weight of the moment, the fragility of it. One wrong move, one thoughtless word, and the small thread holding them together would snap. She took a breath, steadying herself before speaking again. "I know I haven't been kind to you," she admitted, the words tasting foreign yet necessary. "And I can't change the past, but I want to do better." Success didn't respond right away. Instead, she studied Margaret carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was yet another fleeting attempt or something real. Finally, she gave a small nod, barely noticeable, but there. Margaret exhaled, feeling something in her chest loosen just a little. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. The kitchen was unusually quiet that morning, save for the rhythmic chopping of vegetables on the wooden cutting board. Margaret moved with deliberate care, her hands steady as she prepared breakfast. It had been years since she had taken the time to cook for someone other than herself. Richard usually handled the meals, and Success had long learned to fend for herself. But today, Margaret wanted to do something different, something small yet meaningful. The night before had left her unsettled, though not in the way she had expected. Sitting across from Success, seeing the guarded expression on the girl's face, had stirred something deep within her. It wasn't just regret, It was the realization that she had spent years holding on to resentment without ever pausing to understand the damage it had caused. She had assumed that her pain justified her actions, that her suffering excused her cruelty. But it didn't. Not in the way she once believed. Now, standing in the warmth of the kitchen, she found herself wondering if it was too late to mend what had been broken. Success entered the room just as Margaret was setting the table. The girl hesitated at the threshold, clearly caught off guard by the sight before her. Margaret forced a small smile, gesturing toward the food. "I made breakfast," she said, keeping her tone light. Success nodded, moving cautiously to take a seat. They ate in near silence, the clinking of utensils against porcelain the only sound between them. Margaret stole glances at the young woman across from her, noting the way she kept her gaze lowered, as if waiting for the familiar sting of reprimand. The realization made Margaret's stomach twist. She wanted to say something, to fill the silence with words that might bridge the distance between them, but the weight of years spent at odds was not so easily lifted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she set down her fork and spoke. "I owe you an apology," she admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Success stiffened slightly, but she did not interrupt. "I was wrong," Margaret continued. "I've been wrong for a long time, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I want you to know that I see it now. I see the ways I've hurt you." The words felt raw, unfamiliar, but necessary. Success remained silent, her expression unreadable. Margaret braced herself for rejection, for indifference, for anything that might confirm her fears that she had waited too long to make amends. But instead, Success let out a breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of her plate. "You've never said anything like this before," she murmured, her voice almost hesitant. Margaret swallowed, nodding. "I know," she admitted, "and I regret that." Another silence stretched between them, but this time it did not feel as heavy as before. Margaret watched as Success reached for her cup of tea, her movement slow, thoughtful. "I don't know how to respond," the girl finally admitted. Margaret offered a small, understanding nod. "You don't have to," she said simply. "Not yet." And for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the beginning of something new. The late afternoon sun filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the reflection of herself in the glass cabinet across the room. The image looking back at her was familiar, yet unsettling. She had spent so many years convincing herself that she was justified in her anger, that her harshness was a response to the disappointments life had dealt her. But now, as she sat in the quiet stillness of the house, she saw herself differently. The lines on her face were not just from age, but from the weight of resentment she had carried. The tightness in her chest wasn't just from stress, but from years of pushing away the very people who could have offered her warmth. The realization was not comforting, it was jarring, like suddenly finding herself in a room full of mirrors, each one revealing a different truth she had refused to acknowledge. She had hurt Success, but she had also hurt herself. And the more she thought about it, the more she wondered if her struggles, the miscarriages, the loneliness, had been a reflection of the bitterness she had refused to release. A knock on the front door pulled her from her thoughts, the sudden sound breaking the thick silence that had settled in the house. Margaret rose to her feet, smoothing down the fabric of her dress before making her way to the entrance. When she opened the door, she found Helen standing there, her expression unreadable. It had been days since their last conversation, and Margaret knew she had been avoiding her sister's concerned gaze. But Helen, ever persistent, had returned. And this time, she was not going to let Margaret retreat into herself again. "I was in the neighborhood," Helen said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Margaret didn't argue. She simply closed the door behind her and gestured for Helen to sit. They settled into the living room, the tension between them palpable. Helen studied Margaret for a long moment before speaking. "You've been quiet," she observed. "That usually means you're thinking about something." Margaret exhaled, her fingers tightening around the hem of her dress. "I opened the storage box," she admitted. Helen's expression softened, but she said nothing, waiting for Margaret to continue. "I found the letters, the maternity gown, and I remembered things I had tried to forget." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pushed forward. "I wasn't a kind child, Helen. I was cruel to our aunt. And now, I wonder if everything I've gone through has been a consequence of that." Helen sighed, leaning forward to rest her elbows on her knees. "Margaret, life doesn't work like that," she said gently. "Pain doesn't always come as punishment. Sometimes it just happens. But I do think you've been holding on to something heavy for too long." Margaret swallowed, her throat dry. She wanted to believe Helen's words, to accept that she wasn't cursed, that her struggles weren't a direct retribution for her past, but a part of her still clung to the guilt, to the possibility that she had doomed herself. "What if I did this to myself?" she asked quietly. Helen reached for her hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "Then let it go," she urged. "You can't change the past, Margaret, but you can decide how you move forward." Margaret's eyes stung, but for the first time, she didn't shy away from the emotions welling up inside her. Perhaps Helen was right. Perhaps healing wasn't about undoing what had been done, but about choosing a different path. And for the first time in years, Margaret felt the smallest crack in the walls she had built around herself. The rain drummed steadily against the roof, its rhythmic tapping filling the quiet house. Margaret sat by the bedroom window, watching as droplets traced slow paths down the glass. There had been a shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable change that had taken root within her. It was strange, almost unsettling, to feel the weight of her bitterness begin to ease. She had carried it for so long that its absence left an unfamiliar emptiness in its place. For years she had clung to her pain as though it were a shield, something to justify her coldness toward others. But now, as she reflected on her conversation with Helen, she realized that holding on to the past had not protected her. It had only isolated her. She thought about success, about the guarded way the girl looked at her, as though always bracing for an unkind word. The memory left a dull ache in her chest. How many times had she wounded the girl without even thinking? How many times had she mistaken cruelty for strength? Margaret exhaled, rubbing her palms together as if trying to warm them. She wasn't sure if change could undo the damage, but for the first time, she was willing to try. Downstairs, the sound of the front door opening caught her attention. She knew it was Success returning from the store, having reluctantly agreed to pick up a few things earlier that afternoon. Margaret hesitated before standing, smoothing the fabric of her dress as she stepped into the hallway. She made her way downstairs, her heartbeat quickening slightly. Success was in the kitchen, setting a bag of groceries on the counter. The girl didn't look up immediately, her posture tense, as though expecting Margaret to find fault with something. The sight pained Margaret more than she cared to admit. She moved carefully, pulling out a chair and sitting down across from her stepdaughter. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncertain. Margaret licked her lips before speaking, her voice softer than usual. "Thank you for going to the store," she said. Success stilled for a fraction of a second, as if unsure she had heard correctly. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a flicker of confusion. "It's nothing," she murmured, quickly turning her attention back to the groceries. Margaret knew that one moment of kindness would not erase years of harshness, but she didn't let that deter her. She needed to show, not just say, that she was changing. Margaret reached for an orange from the bag, running her fingers over its rough skin. "Would you like some tea?" she asked. It was a small offering, but to her, it felt significant. Success hesitated, her expression guarded. Then, after a long pause, she gave a small nod. Margaret stood, moving to the stove to prepare the tea. The silence between them no longer felt so suffocating. As she worked, She stole glances at Success, noting how the girl's shoulders had relaxed ever so slightly. This was new territory for both of them, tentative, fragile, but it was a start. Margaret knew she could not rush this, could not demand instant forgiveness. But as she poured the tea into 2 cups and placed one in front of Success, she allowed herself to hope. The years of distance between them would not disappear overnight, but for the first time, there was something else growing in its place, the possibility of healing. And as they sat there, sipping tea in silence, Margaret felt the first stirrings of something she had nearly forgotten: peace. The night air was thick with silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves outside the window. Margaret lay awake, her hands folded over her stomach as she stared at the ceiling. Sleep had become elusive in recent days, not because of unrest, but because her mind was unraveling memories she had long ignored. The dream had come again, vivid, almost too real. She saw herself as a child standing in her aunt's room, her voice sharp and unforgiving as she berated the weary woman. The pain in her aunt's eyes had been unmistakable, but Margaret, too young and too blind in her arrogance, had not cared. And then came the words, the curse, spoken with a quiet finality. "You will never know the joy of motherhood." Margaret squeezed her eyes shut, as if willing the memory away, but it clung to her like a second skin. Could it be true? Had she truly brought this upon herself? For so long she had convinced herself that her struggles were random misfortunes, but the weight of that curse sat heavily in her mind now. And yet, even if the past could not be undone, could the future still be rewritten? A sudden sound from the hallway pulled her from her thoughts. The cautious shuffling of feet, the creak of a door. Success was still awake. Margaret hesitated before rising, the floor cool beneath her bare feet as she stepped out of her room. She found Success standing by the living room window, wrapped in a thin blanket, her gaze distant as she stared out into the night. There was something fragile about the way she stood there, something that made Margaret's heart tighten. She cleared her throat softly, and Success turned, startled by her presence. "Couldn't sleep?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice gentle. Success shrugged, her fingers gripping the edges of the blanket. "I get used to staying up late," she admitted, her tone neutral. Margaret nodded, stepping closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "I used to think a lot at night, too," she confessed. "Some things are harder to face in the daylight." Success glanced at her then, something flickering in her expression, curiosity, perhaps even a sliver of understanding. Margaret swallowed, bracing herself before she continued. "I wasn't fair to you," she admitted. "I don't know if I can ever undo what I've done, but I don't want us to be strangers in this house anymore." The words felt raw, unpolished, but they were the closest to the truth Margaret had ever spoken. Success remained silent, her gaze lowering to the floor. Margaret feared she had said too much, or perhaps not enough. But then, slowly, Success nodded. "I don't know if I can forget everything," she murmured. "But I don't want to keep hating you either." The admission was quiet, hesitant, but it cracked something open between them. Margaret exhaled, her chest loosening for the first time in years. She didn't expect immediate forgiveness, nor did she deserve it. But as they stood together in the dimly lit room, something unspoken passed between them, a fragile, unsteady truce. Margaret reached out, hesitated, then gently touched Success's hand. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but the girl did not pull away. And in that moment, Margaret understood. Change was not about erasing the past, but about choosing to move forward despite it. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, they still had time to heal. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the room. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting on her stomach, feeling the steady rise and fall of her breath. It had been weeks since the dream, weeks since she had begun to truly confront the weight of her past, and something within her had shifted. There was still fear Fear that the damage she had caused could never fully be undone. Fear that the fragile bond she was rebuilding with success might crumble under the weight of old wounds. But there was also hope. Hope that the burden she had carried for so long was finally beginning to loosen its grip on her. She thought back to the night she had stood in the living room with success, the hesitant exchange of words that had felt more like a step toward healing than anything else in the years they had lived under the same roof. It was a slow process, one that required patience, but Margaret found herself willing to wait. And as she pressed a hand against her belly, she allowed herself, for the first time in a long while, to believe in the possibility of joy. The aroma of freshly brewed tea drifted through the house as Margaret made her way to the kitchen. She found Success standing by the counter, reaching for a cup, her movements unhurried. There was a quiet ease in the girl's posture that hadn't been there before, and Margaret felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. "Good morning," she said softly. Success glanced at her, nodding. "Morning." The exchange was simple, unremarkable even, but it carried a weight that Margaret understood all too well. She stepped forward, reaching for the kettle, and without hesitation poured Success a cup before filling her own. The silence that followed was not heavy or strained. It was comfortable, a shared moment that did not need to be filled with unnecessary words. They sat together at the small dining table, sipping their tea, and Margaret realized that this was what she had longed for all along. Not grand gestures of forgiveness, not dramatic declarations, but this, a quiet understanding, a willingness to exist in the same space without hostility. She glanced at Success, watching as the girl stared into her cup, lost in thought. "I was thinking of getting some fabric today," Margaret said carefully. "Maybe you'd like to come with me?" She expected hesitation, maybe even rejection, but to her surprise, Success looked up and gave a small nod. "Yeah, that sounds nice." The answer sent a warmth through Margaret's chest, something light and unfamiliar. She had spent so long believing that happiness was something just out of reach, something reserved for others, but never for herself. But now, sitting here, she realized that happiness was not about perfection. It was about moments like these. The past would always be a part of her, a shadow that lingered in the corners of her memory, but it did not have to define her. She could choose kindness, she could choose love, and she could choose to be better. And as she stood up, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead, she felt the stirrings of a new beginning. Not just for herself, but for the family she was finally learning to cherish. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.